Hey everybody, Ben here. Before we dive into today's episode, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you to Dagish Academy's Phosphine Certification Program. Our video-based interactive program is one of the most comprehensive courses available on the topic of phosphine fumigations, and we cover everything you need to know from initial inspections and bidding all the way to the aeration and deactivation process at the end. And you'll also learn all about pest identification, calculating dosages, sealing the structure, and so much more. So if you're interested in learning more about this course, please reach out to us at training@dagishamerica.com. And hey, if you mention the podcast in your email, you'll receive a coupon code for 25% off the purchase price. Yeah, I said that right, 25% off the purchase price. So we look forward to hearing from you, and happy training. Now, on to the podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to Dagish America Presents. I'm Ben Hottel, host of the podcast, and I am so happy to have the opportunity to talk to you again about the industry that I work in. Last episode, we talked about the benefits of utilizing mating disruption to reduce pest populations. Now, if you haven't had an opportunity to listen to that episode yet, I highly suggest that you do so. It has a ton of really awesome information. On today's episode, we'll be talking about another tool that we use to inhibit an insect's life cycle, growth regulators. And to help us today, we've invited Pat Hottel, Technical Manager at McLeod Rentokil, to join us. So please help me welcome Pat to the podcast. Pat, how are you doing today?
I am doing well.
That's good. So I know you've been a guest on the podcast before, but for anybody who may not have listened to your previous episode, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be terrific.
Well, I'm a technical manager currently for Rentokil Terminix, specializing in fumigation, fairly new role for me. Previously, and most of my career was spent with McLeod Services, which is headquartered near Chicago. McLeod was acquired back in 2019 by Terminix, and then Terminix and Rentokil, of course, then merged. Previously, and part of my work with McLeod was specializing in food plant pest management. That was the focus of McLeod, and most of my experience comes from that. I have over 45 years of pest management experience and a degree in entomology, so I'm an entomologist.
Yeah, I know you've had a very robust career and you've worked in a lot of different facets in the pest control industry. So we've known each other for a long time, and I know that I've relied on you in the past with technical questions, and you've always been able to come through and help me out with that. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Well, you are certainly welcome, and I appreciate the support and help as well that you've given to me over the years.
Oh, happy to do it whenever I can. So this season, we've been kind of talking about treatment methods or control methods outside of fumigation. You know, fumigation's always been kind of our bread and butter, and fumigation's always going to be necessary. It's never going to go away. But I wanted to focus on some of the other tools in that toolbox that we work with. And one of those things that I wanted to address on this season was growth regulators. You know, growth regulators have been around for a long time, but I think there's still some folks out there who have little experience with them or no experience with them. And I just thought if we had a conversation about growth regulators, it may be of benefit to those folks. So I just kind of wanted to start out by asking you if you could just kind of define for us what a growth regulator is.
Of course. So insect growth regulators, or we refer to them as IGRs, right, are classes of insecticides which will interfere with the development of insects. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, right? There are, however, two main types of insect growth regulators. So we can split them into two main types or groups. And the most common, I think that most people that work in the food industry are familiar with, are what we might call the hormone mimics. Examples of those, and there's two examples I'm going to give you, although one of those groups or mimics isn't really available to us currently. There are no products that are used in structural pest management under that mimic. But the juvenile hormone, what we might call juvenile hormone or JHA analogs, mimic the hormones that are found in insects or immature insects that what we could say arrest development. So basically, there's a hormone within insects that will decline in an immature insect that declines over time that allows through that declining quantity of hormone in the insect to mature. And when we use a JHA or juvenile hormone mimic, what happens is that insect continues to remain. And so why we call it arrested development, right? Because it continues to remain in that immature stage. It's not developing normally. The resulting is that it either dies in the immature stage. There are some that will affect egg stages, and it's again going to depend on the type of product and the species involved. And then sometimes we get sterility in adults. So they actually do make it to the adult stage, but they're sterile. Probably the most common example of that would be what we see in German cockroaches, right? When we use the JHA hydroprene with German cockroaches, you can get development all the way to adult, and you'll see that effect through twisted wings.
Oh, yes. I've
if
seen
you've
that.
used it, right? So the twisted wings, it's not developed normally, right? Those adults are also sterile. They're not able to reproduce. So those are those JHAs. I mentioned hydroprene, methoprene. Some of us may be familiar, especially in the food industry, because
Yeah.
it's used commonly, right, for stored product pest is another example. And another material, pyriproxyfen, also has several labeled uses and used in food processing industry as another example, as an active ingredient of those JHAs. That other group that I mentioned as that's a hormone mimic are the ecdysone mimics. Again, we don't have any of those, to my knowledge, available to us in structural pest control. There are some uses on plants, vegetation, for pests that attack those in the greenhouse industry, for example. Currently, though, none for structural, and it's affecting molting. So we're actually increasing, when we use these ecdysone mimics, increasing a hormone that's responsible for molting, and the insects actually are kept molting. It interferes with the stopping of that molting process, so they overmolt and die in that regard. Again, we don't have that particular class or group of hormone mimics available to us in structural. Then the second main type are the chitin synthesis inhibitors. We do have these products available to us in the structural pest control industry. And novaluron is one example. It's most commonly used in termite control and termite control baits, this group. And how these work, they interfere with the enzymes that are used and needed to synthesize chitin, which is an important ingredient in the exoskeleton of the insect.
Yeah.
So as we interfere with that development of chitin for the exoskeleton, we kill the insect. So two different types of modes of actions, those that are the hormone mimics, and then those that are chitin synthesis inhibitors and prevent the proper development of the exoskeleton.
Okay, yeah. So a broad range of growth regulators or insect growth regulators that are available on the market. And just out of curiosity, and I don't know if you have any knowledge on this or not, but do you think that there's going to be any opportunity for an insecticide, I think, with the Dyson mimic anytime soon?
I haven't been able to find that, and Ben, if you want, I can do some further research, check with some of the manufacturers to see if anybody is looking at those materials for structural use, but nothing evident in my search that I performed.
Okay, yeah, I was just asking out of curiosity. I mean, I do think that the insect growth regulators that we currently have on the market work very well. So I don't know if there's really a pressing need for a new variety of growth regulators on the market because, at least to my experience, I have seen very little issue with any of the growth regulators that we've used.
Yeah, so, there is some level of resistance being seen out there, methoprene being one of them, and in particular with mosquitoes. So having those available tools with different modes of action can always be something that we would like to see, right?
Right.
Because, having that ability to use a material, if we do come across resistance issues that might have a different mode of action, can be beneficial to the industry. So I'm not sure at this point what's available or what's being researched there, but always open and encouraged that might be a possibility.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it sound like, there's no room for additional growth regulators. There's certainly room for additional growth regulators to come out on the market. So I am eager to see, studies on some of this stuff, especially considering, there may be some kind of a future risk of like resistance to
Mhm.
certain growth regulators that are on the market. So I also kind of wanted to ask you about this because we've already talked about, what a growth regulator is, the different types that are out there, how they actually work. What's some of the history of these insect growth regulators? I mean, how long have they been around? How long have they been used? Did we kind of quote borrow them from a different industry and then bring them into ours? I mean, what's the history of that?
Right. So, been around for at least 50 years, which seems remarkable to me in a way that they have been around that long. And to some extent, born out of a desire to use materials that might be more targeted to specific insects or to insects in general, right? Environmental concerns regarding some of the insecticides that we were using in the 50s and 60s, right?
Yeah.
So offered that alternative and that potential for a material with less environmental impact, but been around for quite a while. Methoprene, we've already mentioned that particular compound, was first on the market to my knowledge and used and developed both for mosquito control. So we saw early on Alticid being marketed, if it's okay for me to use trade names,
Sure.
for mosquito control. They had that same company had developed feed through for on animal use and in animal diets, feed through methoprene based materials for actually targeting fly control. So fed to cattle and then through passing through the cattle's system to help control flies in manure as a result of cattle production. We saw IGRs early on used for flea control on animal.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So those were some of the early uses. And then use for post harvest through the introduction of Diacon for post harvest grain use. Interesting. I think that we didn't see industry embrace necessarily the use of methoprene or other IGRs initially, especially for stored product pests. And it got me thinking as I was preparing for this talk, why was that, right?
Yeah.
Why didn't we see the industry embrace IGRs for stored product pest control? And I think it's a challenge and still a challenge today to see some of the more immediate results that we might have experienced with either mosquito control because of the short life cycles, flea control, right?
Yeah.
IGRs took off pretty quickly and embraced by industry pretty quickly for flea control. Same for fly control. Again, you had this short life cycle, right? And you could see those results. And I remember one of the first times hog processing facility that we serviced that had hogs come to the site for slaughter, and with that delivery, there would be manure and other organic material that you could find in cracks and crevices in the paved areas outside of where the hogs were unloaded. And we had, as a result, serious filth fly problems at that facility, originating mostly from the exterior going in. And we used pyrethroids primarily as a tool, which was a common tool for filth fly control for many years, but also we knew we had resistance issues with filth flies and the pyrethroids. So the pyrethroids weren't really working, and we would apply the pyrethroids on the exterior into some of these cracks and crevices where the manure and other organic material was accumulating. And we would get these maggots bubbling back
Yeah.
out of the cracks and crevices as we applied the pyrethroid sprays to these surfaces. So no real control results. We weren't impacting the larval stage of the flies. We then went to IGRs, and pyriproxyfen in particular can be used on the exterior. It's got some photostability to it. We applied the pyriproxyfen, and lo and behold, no bubbling maggots anymore.
Yeah.
So those are really good visual evidence of control. We don't see that as easily with the stored product pest, right? It's a little bit harder. And to some extent, I think that has to do with the life cycles of these pests that can be fairly long. If you think about warehouse beetle larvae, for example, we're trying to impact that larval stage with an IGR. It could take a while for those IGRs to control, even more so, right, than fleas, mosquitoes, flies that have this fairly rapid development.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, though. I think a lot of people, when you provide a treatment for them, especially around food, they really prefer or want to see that immediate response. They want to see that quick knockdown. And with growth regulators, you don't always see that quick knockdown because sometimes it takes that full life cycle before you see the results. You will see them, and it can be some really stark positive results if you give it enough time. But that immediate knockdown, sometimes you don't see that right away, and that can be discouraging to people who are facing an insect infestation to not see that immediate result.
Exactly, and even more so with stored product pests. So you need to think about the stored product pests that you are applying this and using this IGR for. What is that developmental time? When you think about things like flower beetles, right, as adults, and these are going to impact immature stages, right? But you could have adults present with a lifespan of a year or more. So you're not going to impact those adults. And certainly we combine our treatments, and the suggestion is to not use IGRs typically on their own, right? You're going to use something as an adulticide to control the adults, but we have to keep that in mind. What is that stored product pest that we're targeting? How long do adults live? How long is the larval developmental time? And what does that mean for control? And as you mentioned, certainly they do impact stored product pests. Research supports their effectiveness for stored product pests, but it may be a little bit more difficult for us to see those results as illustrated as we see with flies, fleas, and even cockroaches.
Yeah, boy, the reaction with fleas almost seems immediate. Anytime I've used growth regulators with fleas, it feels like it's almost an immediate result. It's pretty remarkable how fast growth regulators will work on flies and fleas.
And I did want to mention that more recently, we have seen an increase in kind of this, when we're talking about the history of IGR use, we're seeing more of these combination products. So we were talking a little bit about stored product pests and the importance of using something to kill the adults, adulticide, in combination with the IGRs. In recent years, we see an increase in the number of products that are being marketed with both an IGR and an adulticide combined.
Yeah.
Makes it easier for us to apply because mixing your own combination of, let's say, pyrethrin and an IGR for space treatment can be a little bit challenging to come up with the right portions. If it's pre-mixed, it's easier, right? So having these
Yeah.
combo products, whether it be designed for space treatment, there are aerosol combination products. There are bait products that combine something that will kill as the adults and other stages, as well as an IGR mixed in. Fairly recent and development in the IGR history, and something that's got some great advantages for us from a control standpoint.
Oh, yeah. So we started kind of dipping our toes into this application process, like mixing the IGRs with the adulticides. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the most common ways that we use or apply growth regulators?
So there's a lot of ways that we can
Yeah.
apply insect growth regulators. And I started talking a little bit about baits, right? So
Yeah.
some of the IGRs are being mixed and incorporated in the bait matrix. So you've got, again, something that's going to kill adults in other stages, as well as an IGR being mixed into the bait. Sometimes it's a standalone IGR in a bait. And an example of that would be those that are used in termite control, baits that are used for subterranean termite control. One of the earliest IGR baits that I recall using, we're getting back into history here a little bit, was a product called Ferrorid. And early in my career at McLeod, Pharaoh ants were a major problem, not so much anymore in the
Yeah.
US, but back then we really struggled with control. And one of the manufacturers, Zoecon, developed a product called Ferrorid, which was methoprene, which actually had to mix yourself with a food bait and then place it out for Pharaoh ant control, and a really effective material. Again, kind of that mixing and having to do your own mixing was a little bit of a challenge. And eventually, Pharaoh ants declined in pest status. There were also some products that then came out with boric acid-based materials that were used for Pharaoh ant control, but early success story there with baits and showing us the value, perhaps, of how these IGRs could be incorporated into baits. Currently, there are ant baits that are available, again, with IGR and other materials for kill. Cockroach baits now also being incorporated with IGRs. And when it comes to cockroaches, keep in mind that there can be some benefit when we talk about German cockroaches, where they actually, the effect of the IGR can be that it increases feeding, particularly of gravid female German cockroaches. And so using an IGR alongside a bait, even if the bait doesn't contain an IGR, but using it as a spray can have some benefit, increasing foraging activity of that German cockroach female that normally does not travel very far from the harborage and doesn't feed very much when she's carrying that egg case, but increasing her desire to feed can help us deliver a toxicant to her through baits if we can increase her feeding behavior. So that's another advantage of an IGR, or potential advantage of IGRs.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And that work was done by Kobe Shaw out of NC State, showing that, or Kobe Shaw's lab. Jules Silverman, I think, also involved in that research and discovery. In addition to bait sprays, and already talked about the advantages and the fact that a lot of the manufacturers are doing these combo products, right? So we've got the adulticide with the IGR available in a spray. And then even some manufacturers are putting more than one IGR into a spray. So we're mixing those juvenile hormone analogs with a chitin synthesis inhibitor. So 2 different actions of IGR in one product. So again, adulticide plus IGR and then multiple IGRs. So we're attacking at different modes of action, can be helpful with resistance. It can also affect different stages of the insect. Maybe one is better at the larval stage. Maybe one has some impact on eggs. Again, all depending on species and the IGR that's using. But those combos, I think, should be looked at for those benefits.
Sure.
Then we can do space treatments, right? So treatments as what we might call a fog. And again, they could be used alone, but in combination, and typically they are, right? We're using not just the IGR when we're targeting, let's say, stored product pests, but we're using an IGR with an adulticide. And that could be anything from pyrethrins to pyrethroids to Vapona. And again, with some of these space treatment products, and we see this with cylinderized fogging materials such as Vapona, that we can get IGRs incorporated in with that adulticide.
Yeah. And I know there's been studies, degradation studies done on cylinderized Vapona and S-methoprene in particular, or Diacon, that shows that there's virtually no degradation of the growth regulator during that mixing process. That was a question that came up several years ago, whether or not dichlorobos or Vapona would actually degrade that product. But there's been studies shown now that it doesn't, or at least it's so minimal that it doesn't affect its efficacy.
Right. And so one of the reasons, though, that it is blended, custom blended, right, is to ensure that insect growth regulator is still effective, right? That it's
Yes.
blended custom shortly before the space treatment is to occur.
Yep.
There's also pelleted forms, most commonly used for aquatic insects like mosquitoes. Medications, we've talked about that on animal for flea control. And then kind of what I'm going to call the puck format. And I can only think of one example would be the hydroprene material that is used, can be used for stored product pests or cockroaches, where there's a little ampule. It's in a plastic container with a filter paper. You break the ampule that's on this plastic holder, and it volatilizes off. Hydroprene is one of those IGRs that is very volatile. Pros and cons to that. Pro is that it will move. And if you want a material that will move, volatilize off, it will do that. On the other hand, it shortens the residual life of that hydroprene because of the volatility. But that's a material that can be used. We have used it in things like electrical boxes in food plants, as an example. It needs to be confined in an area for best results. So electrical panels might be an example of where you might use that product.
I haven't had a chance to use that particular product type or that application type, but it definitely sounds pretty interesting. And I think electric boxes would be a great location for that type of a product.
Yeah, and it has German cockroach uses as well. So I would say probably the most common uses would be either German cockroaches in confined areas or stored product pests.
Okay. So, Pat, I only have one question left for you.
Yep.
I ask a version of this question for every guest on the podcast, usually about the topic that we're discussing. But what advice would you give a new fumigator or a new pest control technician? What advice would you give them about using growth regulators responsibly?
Well, of course, for any pest management program, right, it's not just the chemical control aspects of the program that are important. And sanitation in particular, very important when we're talking about food facilities, food plant pest. Research has shown that not just with IGRs, but any of the adulticides that we use, we can get decreased results when there's food sources available. It also makes it more difficult to get to the source, right? So sanitation, stressing sanitation with our clients is very, very important. Of course, the integrated approach, right? Emphasize sanitation. I would say use those combination products, right? as a strategy to reduce resistance as well as impact efficacy in other ways. So take advantage of those combo products. Again, the products that have more than one type of IGR, more than one mode of action of IGR in that product, as well as the importance of using adulticides in combination with the IGRs. Target areas where those immatures are, and I think very important when we're talking about our space treatments. Yes, incorporate IGRs with the adulticide for your space treatment, but also make sure that you are looking at where those harbor sites, those source sites are, and target those with sprays or dust or other materials as appropriate. Don't rely just on that space treatment to get that IGR or control, keeping in mind that we need to try to contact them. And yes, you'll get control from, let's say, Indian meal moth larvae walking along a surface that's been treated with an IGR. But even better delivery, more effective method is to try to contact those insects as much as possible directly. The value of an IGR and something to keep in mind, and I don't think we've discussed already, is that when we're using, let's say, pyrethrins or other fogging materials, the residual life of those adulticides is going to be fairly short, right? Adding an IGR adds residual capability, and that's part of the value, right? You're not only just using two different modes of action, but you're also adding residual. And so, again, encouraging the use of IGRs with your adulticide applications for space. Consider your environment where you're applying it. I gave the example of the flies, of fly control and use of pyriproxyfen on the exterior of the structure. Certain IGRs are going to degrade more quickly than others. So hydroprene, for example, can't even be used outside because it's not labeled, and it's not labeled because it's going to degrade so rapidly. So think about where you're applying it, what might be the best IGR for that application, and of course, follow labels. Surface also can make a difference, as with any pesticide. Some type of formulation you're using, if it's a porous surface and you're using a liquid spray, you may have that risk, and depending even on the type of liquid formulation that's used, but risk of it absorbing into the surface. So hydroprene not as effective on a concrete surface, let's say, as a spray, as it would be on, let's say, metal. Do your homework, and so know what your target insect is and what the expectations will be for control based on the life cycle of the insect. And do some research on which of the IGRs might have better data showing efficacy for that particular pest. And again, modify your expectations and understand that these are slower acting materials and you may not see those quick results that you can see with other types of pesticide. Lastly, I will say support more research. Encourage universities and researchers. There's not a whole lot of stored product pest research that's being done. It's limited. There's just a couple of universities and USDA doing some of that work, but certainly we could use more studies.
Right.
One of the things I don't think we talked about is that some of the IGRs have shown the capability of being picked up by adults and transferred. So you kind of get this distribution of the IGR. Been work done on both mosquitoes and flies showing this, that adults picking up that IGR off of a surface and then moving it. The insect is moving it. Well, does that happen with stored product pests? That might be an area of research that could be done. So I encourage listeners to look for and encourage, if they have any influences with local centers of urban pest management research, to do more stored product pest research.
And I would also furthermore say, be willing to take part in some of those studies.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these researchers are looking for people in the field to partner with where they can actually do some research in real world scenarios. So be willing to work with those folks because they are just trying to make your job easier in the long run.
And there are shortages of insects to study. So, for example, recently we tried to get someone to do some research on red-legged hand beetles and that we would sponsor, right? We couldn't find a university that has red-legged hand beetles in culture. So being able to provide, when those requests come from industry, to provide insects in numbers for those colonies to be developed can be a way that we can help promote that research as well.
Absolutely. Well, Pat, that's all I had for you today. I really appreciate you taking some time out to help us understand how and when to use growth regulators responsibly.
Well, thank you, Ben, for the invite, and happy to be with you and your audience today.
Yes, very much appreciated. Thanks. I want to thank Pat for explaining to us just how growth regulators work. They are a very important option for us to consider in the fight against stored product pests. On the next episode of Dagish America Presents, we'll be talking about ways to protect the grain rather than controlling the growth cycle of the insect. And remember, if you have a question you'd like for us to answer, please feel free to email us at podcast@dagishamerica.com. You can also find us on our website at dagishamerica.com or on all of the main social media outlets. So, until next time, I'm Ben Harrell, and I hope you have a safe and terrific day.